September 8th, 1935. The backstage air at the Capitol Theater in New York City was thick with stale cigarette smoke, cheap cologne, and the smell of fear. Major Bose, the man who held the keys to the kingdom of radio, looked down his nose at the group huddled in the corner. They were called the Three Flashes, a trio of dancers who had been hustling for pennies in New Jersey. But today, there was a fourth. A skinny, malnourished-looking kid with ears that stuck out like car doors and a scar running down the left side of his neck. He was trembling. His suit was second-hand, draped over a frame that looked like it would snap in a strong wind. The stage manager whispered to Major Bose, asking if they should really let the skinny kid go on, joking that he might faint before he reached the microphone. The audience was already restless, hungry for entertainment or a disaster. When the light turned red, signaling they were live on air to millions, the boy stepped forward. He didn't dance. He just stood there, clutching the microphone stand as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He opened his mouth, and for a split second, the silence in the theater was heavy with judgment. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? But when the sound finally came out, it wasn't the wobble of a nervous teenager. It was a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of the ocean, a smooth, velvety baritone that defied physics. The boy was Frank Sinatra, and in that moment, he didn't just sing a song. He declared war on a world that had told him he was nothing. The audience at the Capitol Theater didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the birth of the 20th century's greatest voice. It was the first crack in the dam, the moment before the flood. But to understand why this moment was a miracle, you have to understand that Frank Sinatra was never supposed to be on that stage. In fact, he was never supposed to be alive at all. To understand the fire that burned inside the man they would one day call the chairman of the board, you have to go back to a cold kitchen in Hoboken, New Jersey, on December 12th, 1915. It was a brutal winter, and the birth was even more brutal. The baby was massive, weighing in at nearly 13.5 pounds. The doctor, struggling with the delivery, used forceps, clamping them down hard on the infant's head. He pulled and twisted, ripping the baby's left ear and slashing his cheek and neck. When Frank finally emerged, he wasn't breathing. He was blue, silent, and motionless. The doctor, convinced the child was a stillborn tragedy, laid the limp body on the cold kitchen counter and turned his attention to saving the mother, Dolly, who was hemorrhaging. But the baby's grandmother, a woman of old-world superstition and iron will, wasn't ready to accept death. She grabbed the blue infant, carried him to the sink, and ran him under freezing cold water. She slapped his back over and over until a gasp of air finally rushed into his scarred lungs. He cried out. It was his first performance, a defiance of death itself. That scar on his neck would remain forever, a physical reminder that his very existence was a fight. He grew up in the shadow of the New York skyline, just across the river, looking at the gleaming towers of Manhattan from the gritty, soot-covered streets of Hoboken. He was an only child in a neighborhood where families had 10 kids. He was lonely, frail, and constantly targeted by the tougher kids on the block. But he had something they didn't. He had Dolly. Dolly Sinatra was a force of nature, a midwife, a barmaid, and a local political fixer who knew every judge and cop in the county. She was fierce, often violent, and loved Frank with a suffocating intensity. She dressed him in little Lord Fauntleroy suits that got him beaten up, but she also told him he was destined to be a king. Frank spent his evenings sitting near the player piano in his family's tavern, listening to the melodies, watching the drunks and the dreamers. He realized early on that music did something to people. It made the angry men quiet. It made the sad women smile. He wanted that power. He wanted to control the room. If you love stories about the legends who fought their way from the bottom to the top, subscribe for new stories. By the time he was a teenager, The obsession had taken hold. He had seen Bing Crosby perform, and he told his father, Marty, a quiet boxer and fireman, that he was going to be a singer. Marty threw him out of the house. "Get a real job," he yelled. In Hoboken, singing wasn't a job for a man. It was a hobby for sissies. But Frank was possessed. He started singing at the Rustic Cabin, a roadside roadhouse where the pay was non-existent and the feedback was often a beer bottle thrown at the stage. He worked as a singing waiter, dodging fights while trying to perfect his phrasing. He had no training. He couldn't read music. But he had an ear that could hear the space between the notes. He realized that most singers of the era, even the great Crosby, sang in a staccato style, chopping up the lyrics. Frank wanted to sing like a violin. He wanted the line to be continuous, unbroken, a stream of liquid emotion. To do this, he needed breath. He needed lungs of steel. So the skinny kid from Hoboken started going to the public pool. He would swim laps underwater, holding his breath until his lungs burned, until he felt like he would black out, forcing his body to metabolize oxygen more efficiently. He was training like an athlete for a sport nobody knew existed. He would swim the length of the pool on a single breath, over and over, visualizing the musical phrases he wanted to sing. This relentless dedication led him to that stage with Major Bowes, and eventually to the band of Harry James. But the real turning point, the moment the student became the master, was when he joined Tommy Dorsey's band. Dorsey was a perfectionist. Trombone player who could play a melody so smooth it sounded like human speech. Frank watched him every night. He watched how Dorsey would sneak a breath through a tiny pinhole in the corner of his mouth so he wouldn't break the musical line. Frank mimicked it. He mastered it. He started singing long, flowing lines that left the audience breathless because they were unconsciously holding their own breath, waiting for him to inhale. The result was hysteria. They called it the Columbus Day Riot of 1942. Frank had left Dorsey to go solo, a move everyone said was suicide. He was booked at the Paramount Theater in New York. When he walked out on stage, something unprecedented happened. The audience, filled with thousands of teenage girls, the Bobby Soxers, erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a primal scream. They fainted. They wept. They tore at his clothes. The police were called. The city was paralyzed. For a man who had been a lonely boy looking at the city from across the river, he now held the city in the palm of his hand. He was the most famous man in America. He was the voice. But the higher you climb, the harder the wind blows. And Frank Sinatra was about to face a hurricane that would nearly destroy him. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the world changed. The war was over. The sweet, romantic ballads Frank sang started to feel old-fashioned. A new sound was bubbling up, something rougher. And Frank? Frank was falling apart. His turbulent marriage to Nancy ended. His affair with the magnificent and volatile Ava Gardner became tabloid fodder. He was painted as a villain, a homewrecker, a man of loose morals. The press, who had built him up, now decided to tear him down with glee. And then the ultimate tragedy struck. The instrument broke. During a performance at the Copacabana, Frank opened his mouth to sing, and nothing came out but a rasp, a vocal hemorrhage. He stood there, frozen, the orchestra playing behind him, the audience staring in confusion. He was silenced. The doctors told him he might never sing again. The collapse was swift and brutal. His record label, Columbia, dropped him. His movie studio, MGM, fired him. His agent couldn't get his calls returned. He was walking through Times Square one rainy night in 1952, looking up at the marquees. A few years ago, his name would have been the biggest thing on the street. Now, he saw the name of a new sensation, Eddie Fisher. Frank Sinatra was a ghost in his own city. He was broke. He was borrowing money to buy groceries. The has-been label was stamped on his forehead. The despair was so deep that one night, in a lonely apartment, Frank Sinatra turned on the gas oven and sat on the floor, ready to end it all. The only thing that stopped him was a friend walking in at the last minute. He was at rock bottom. The boy who had survived a traumatic birth was now succumbing to a traumatic life. But there is a specific kind of strength that is only forged in the fires of humiliation. Frank realized that the sweet, innocent voice of the 40s was dead. He didn't want to be that boy anymore. He had been broken. He had lost love. He had felt the cold shoulder of the world. He decided that if he was going to come back, he wouldn't just sing the notes, he would sing the pain. He set his sights on a role that everyone told him he was wrong for. Maggio, the scrappy, tragic Italian-American soldier in the upcoming film From Here to Eternity. The studio didn't want him. They wanted a star. They offered the role to Eli Wallach. Frank was desperate. He offered to do it for practically nothing. He flew to Africa, where his wife Ava Gardner was filming, and begged the producer, Harry Cohn. Legend says the mafia intervened, a horse's head in a bed, but the truth was more poignant. Frank simply refused to take no for an answer. He knew Maggio. He was Maggio, the underdog, the skinny guy with too much pride. He got the part. And when the cameras rolled, Frank didn't act. He bled. The death scene of Maggio remains one of the most heartbreaking moments in cinema history. When the film was released, the audience gasped. Was that Frank Sinatra? The washed-up singer? No, it was a new man. This brings us to one of the most critical nights in music history. April 30th, 1953. Capitol Records Studio. Frank had signed a one-year deal with Capitol, a charity contract, really. He was paired with a young arranger named Nelson Riddle. Frank walked into the studio, his hat pushed back on his head, a cigarette dangling from his lip. He was nervous. This was his last shot. If this failed, there was no coming back. The song was I've Got the World on a String. It was an old standard, usually played as a slow ballad. But Frank and Nelson had a different idea. They wanted to attack it. Before we see if Frank could pull off the greatest comeback in entertainment history, I want to remind you, if you find inspiration in stories of resilience and the human spirit, subscribe for new stories. We have so many more legends to explore. The orchestra counted off. Bam! The brass section hit a wall of sound that was sharp, aggressive, and swinging. Frank stepped to the microphone. He didn't croon. He swaggered. I've got the world on a string, sitting on a rainbow. The voice was different. It was deeper, richer, textured with the smoke of 1,000 cigarettes and the heartbreak of 1,000 lonely nights. It was the voice of a man who had been to hell and decided he liked the heat. The musicians in the room looked at each other. They knew. The magic was back, but it was a darker, more potent magic. Frank Sinatra had reinvented pop music. He took the swing beat and married it to the emotional intensity of the blues. He was cool, he was dangerous, and he was undeniably back. When he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for From Here to Eternity later that year, he walked to the podium, took the statue, and looked out at the audience, the same people who had written his obituary a year earlier. He didn't gloat. He just smiled. It was the smile of a survivor. But while the world saw the tuxedo and the Jack Daniels, there was another side to Frank that rarely made the headlines. Just like he had been the protector of his own fragile ego, he became a quiet protector of others. In the late 1950s, Frank was performing in Las Vegas. At that time, Vegas was segregated. Black artists like Sammy Davis Jr. or Nat King Cole could perform on stage, but they couldn't sleep in the hotel or gamble in the casino. They had to stay in boarding houses on the other side of town. Frank found this intolerable. He walked into the office of the casino manager at the Sands. He didn't shout. He spoke in that low, dangerous whisper. "If Sammy can't stay here, I don't stay here. And if I don't stay here, I don't play here." The manager tried to argue, citing policy. Frank leaned in. "And I'll tell all my friends not to play here either." The manager did the math. Losing Frank Sinatra meant losing millions. The policy changed that afternoon. Frank Sinatra desegregated the Las Vegas Strip not with a speech, but with a threat. He paid for people's hospital bills anonymously. When the actor Lee J. Cobb had a heart attack and was facing financial ruin, Frank covered every cent, ensuring Cobb didn't know where the money came from. He was a man of contradictions, violent temper, boundless generosity. He never forgot what it felt like to be the skinny kid everyone laughed at. As the decades rolled on, Frank became more than a singer. He became an institution, the chairman of the board. But the pain never really left him. You could hear it in the saloon songs, albums like In the Wee Small Hours or Only the Lonely. These weren't songs for the happy couples. These were songs for the guys sitting at the end of the bar at 3 a.m., staring into a glass of bourbon, wondering where it all went wrong. Frank sang for them because he was them. There is a story from his later years that captures the essence of the man. It was the 1970s. Frank was playing a massive concert at Madison Square Garden. The arena was shaking with applause. He was older now, the voice a little raspier, the hair graying. He launched into My Way. It had become his anthem, a declaration of defiance. But halfway through the song, he stopped the orchestra. The crowd went silent. Frank looked out into the darkness, past the lights. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I've had a lot of things happen to me. Good things, bad things. But I always tried to give you the truth. Because if you don't give the truth, you're just a jukebox." He finished the song, tears glistening in his blue eyes. He wasn't performing anymore. He was confessing. Wait, don't go yet. We are approaching the final curtain, but if you want to be part of this community of story lovers, make sure to subscribe for new stories. The legacy of Frank. Sinatra isn't just in the records or the movies. It's in the attitude. It's in the idea that you can be bruised, beaten, scarred from birth, and rejected by the world. And you can still put on a tuxedo, snap your brim, and tell the world to go to hell. In his final years, Frank would sit in his compound in Palm Springs, watching the sun go down over the desert. He would listen to his old records, critical to the end. "I should have held that note longer," he would mutter. "I was a little flat there." The perfectionist never rested. When he passed away in 1998, the lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed in his honor. For a few minutes, the loudest city on earth went silent. It was the silence of respect. So, what is the lesson of the kid from Hoboken? It's that talent is only part of the equation. The rest is grit. It's the refusal to stay down when the referee counts to 9. Frank Sinatra was a 13-pound baby they thought was dead. He was a skinny teenager they laughed at. He was a washed-up-as-bin they wrote off. And every single time, he picked himself up, dusted off his jacket, and sang louder. If you are facing a wall today, if you feel like the world has turned its back on you, remember the scar on Frank's neck. Remember the vocal hemorrhage. Remember the empty phone. And then remember the sound of that voice, the voice that proved them all wrong. The next time you hear a Sinatra song, don't just listen to the melody. Listen to the fight. Listen to the survival. Because that is the sound of a man who lived. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe for new stories. And remember, the best is yet to come.